Hey there! This video is going to be a full comparison between the Canon R7 and the Sony FX30, and we'll jump right into it with image quality. Now, to be really upfront about image quality here, in my opinion, they look very similar between these two cameras in 4K 24 frames per second, but we'll do some side-by-side tests here. And for these tests, the Canon R7 was shot in C-Log3, 4K fine, IPB, and the FX30 was shot in 4K XAVC SI. So for this test, I also wanted to keep it as similar as possible between the two cameras. So I actually used the same lens. I used the Sigma 18-35 with the Canon adapter on the R7 and the Sigma MC11 adapter on the FX30. Try to get the image as close as possible. So when I brought these into the computer to grade them, I did some basic corrections. I really didn't mess with the colors very much, so you could see the differences in terms of the image quality and the colors. So check it out. Well, hopefully you can see from those examples there that the image quality is pretty comparable between these two cameras. And, I've shot with both of these out in the real world and they're very, very similar. I think anyone would be happy with the image that comes out of either of these two cameras. And I do want to mention that was all shot at the base ISO of 800. We'll talk more about low light and stuff like that later. So that was all in 4K 24 frames per second. And, let's do some pixel peeping here. So if you first take a look at 4K 24 and you compare these two against each other, you'll see that the image quality and the sharpness and the noise look very similar between these two cameras. And this is really no surprise based on the, comparison of the images that we just saw before this pixel peeping. Now let's go on talking about higher frame rates with these two cameras. And the R7 can shoot up to 4K 60, whereas the FX30 can shoot up to 4K 120, but there's a lot of differences in there. So we'll start with talking about the 4K 60. Now, the R7 can shoot 4K 60 in two different ways. It can shoot in a non-cropped mode, which is full width readout, but at line skips or pixel bin, so it's not an oversampling, or an additional crop mode, which is a 1:1 readout. The FX30 in 4K 60 will do the same 6K oversample that it does in 4K 24. So we should expect to see, a cleaner image out of the FX30 in 4K 60. So if you take a look here, this is the 4K 60 non-crop mode. You can tell that the R7 has slightly less sharpness, but it looks closer than I thought it would. And the R7 definitely has more noise as well. Now we can also take a look at the 4K 60 crop mode. And what that does is it crops in on the sensor, which is an additional 1.81 times crop. And you have to account for that, that crop and deal with that in terms of the focal length. But it is a one-to-one readout. So we'll take a look here at the 4K 60 crop mode against the FX30. And I'll say here that the 4K 60 crop mode is slightly sharper than the non-crop mode, but very similar. I would definitely say that the 4K 60 in the FX30 is definitely better than either of the two modes in the R7 because it is that oversample. Now let's talk about 120 frames per second on these two cameras. The R7 does not shoot in 4K 120, but it does shoot in 1080p 120, so we'll compare that against the 4K 120 in the FX30. So the FX30's 4K 120 has an additional crop on it, and anytime that you crop in on the sensor, you're going to pick up more noise. So let's take a look here at the 1080p 120 versus the 4K 120, and from what I can see here, of course, the 4K 120 is just a little bit sharper and a little less noisy, but it was closer than I thought, and this is really interesting. So if you are using 4K 60 a lot, and that's a big feature that you need, I would definitely say that the FX30 is going to have a better 4K 60 than either of the 4K 60 modes in the R7. Now, 120, I think is a little bit closer, and I think it has to do with the crop that you get in 4K 120 on this camera, but I would say the 4K 120 is definitely better than the 1080p 120. Now let's talk about dynamic range. I didn't do a series of rigorous tests comparing these two cameras, but I have some examples here to give us an idea of how they compare against each other. I would definitely say that the slight edge goes to the FX30, and you'll see that in these examples here. So the first example is the classic shot of me in a dark room next to a window. I exposed the highlights to not clip, and then in post, I tried to see how much information I could save in the shadows. So taking a look at this test here, I think the big difference has to be that the FX30 has a much softer or nicer highlight roll-off. And if you don't know what that means, it's the fact that the highlights or the bright spots in the image are more pleasing and they're just nicer to look at. They're not as harsh looking. And so I think that's a big difference between the log curves in these two cameras. So the R7 can shoot in C-Log3, and if you don't know, C-Log2 is actually the log profile that has the most dynamic range for Canon, whereas the FX30 can shoot in S-Log3, which is the most dynamic range log curve that Sony offers. Now, you can see that in this example here with the highlights, but even in the previous examples that I already showed you in terms of image quality, if you take a look at the car here and you look in the background of the image, you can see the highlight roll-off is better on the FX30. And also this shot here of me, you can also look at the highlights on my face, and I would definitely say the highlight roll-off looks better on the FX30. Now let's talk about low light, and I know a lot of people want to know about the high ISO performance of these cameras. So I recently put out a video, it's very detailed, about the low light performance of these cameras, and I highly recommend that you watch that because there's some really interesting findings. I'll leave that video linked down below. You should definitely go check that out. Essentially, in the lower range of ISOs, they were very, very similar. I'd say the FX30 was a little bit cleaner, but once you get up into the higher range, they were very similar until about 10,000. At 12,800 and 16,000, I would say the R7 was cleaner than the FX30, and 20,000 and above, neither of them were really that good. Now, what was interesting to me about this test was I expected the FX30 to do better than the R7 because Sony claims that it has a dual base ISO of 800 and 2500. But from my testing, when I stepped up through the ISO range, I saw a pretty steady increase of noise on both of these cameras, and this camera acted more like a camera that didn't have a dual base ISO, and it acted very similar to the R7. So it was very interesting. But in terms of low light, I would say up to about 10,000, they're pretty similar. Above that, I would give the slight edge to the R7. Now let's talk about IBIS, or in-body image stabilization. Both these cameras have an IBIS system, but they perform very differently. So for these tests here, I used the Sigma 18-35, which does not have lens stabilization, and I compare this in a few different ways. One was a walking shot, one was a static shot where I was trying to hold the camera as still as possible. So the R7, I shot it with the IBIS on, and then I also did it with the electronic stabilization on top of that in the regular mode, not the enhanced mode. And then in the FX30, I compared the standard stabilization, which is basically like the simple IBIS and the R7, and then the active stabilization, which is, you know, the regular IBIS plus some electronic stabilization with the electronic stabilization in the R7. So take a look. Wow, the R7 looked way better than the FX30 for the walking shot. It didn't even look like the FX30 had any stabilization, but for the static shot, I think they look pretty similar. Let's talk about rolling shutter. For me personally, I don't really care about rolling shutter, but if you shoot a lot of fast moving subjects or the camera's moving around a lot, rolling shutter is definitely a concern for you. So the advantage goes to the FX30 here, and this is probably expected because it's pretty bad on the R7. But taking a look at this example here, as I move the camera back and forth, you can see that the R7, the pole gets kind of bendy and warped. So if you are worried about rolling shutter and that's something that's really important to you, the FX30 is definitely better than the R7. Now these cameras have a lot going for them, and I have a lot that are similar between these two cameras. First of all, they both shoot in 4K 10-bit 422, which we mentioned before. They have very similar image quality, similar dynamic range, low light performance, and the autofocus is great between these two cameras. In 4K 24, as we showed earlier in the video, they look awesome. They look very, very similar. There's also no recording time limits. And if you need an audio solution, you can get one for both of these cameras, and they slide into the hot shoe on the top. You can get the XLR top handle, which is an additional $400 when you buy this camera. You can also get the Tascam unit that slides into this hot shoe on the R7 for an additional $500. So if you need professional audio, there are options for both of these cameras. Now let's get on talking about what's different between these two cameras. I will get onto build quality and the physical characteristics of these cameras in a little bit, but the biggest glaring thing is the fact that the FX30 does not have an electronic viewfinder, whereas the R7 does. And this makes a huge difference for a lot of people, both in photo and video, but probably more so in photography. So I don't cover photography on this channel. I focus on video, as most of you know, but there are some huge differences for photography. Now, the FX30 does not have a mechanical shutter, and you can only take one shot at a time, whereas the R7 is a full-fledged photography camera with, you know, high burst rates and a mechanical shutter and lots of other features, which I'm not going to get into, but there's a big difference in terms of the photography between these two cameras. They both have APS-C size sensors, but slightly different crops. The R7 has a 1.6 times crop. The FX30 is a 1.5 times crop, but when you're shooting video, there's an additional 4% crop, which turns it into a 1.56 times crop. So they're very, very similar. The R7 has a 32.5 megapixel sensor, whereas the FX30 has a 26.1 megapixel sensor. Sometimes it's a little confusing because you'll see the FX30 listed as 20 megapixels, but that's for video because they chop the top and the bottom off. In terms of codecs, there's a huge difference here. The R7 can only shoot in IPB, whereas the FX30 can shoot in IPB, all-I, and a highly compressed HS codec. Again, as I said before, the R7 can shoot up to 4K 60, whereas the FX30 can shoot up to 4K 120. Now let's talk about the build quality and the physical characteristics of these two cameras. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the big differences is the fact that the FX30 does not have an EVF. Also, just by looking at the cameras, they look very different. The R7 looks like a prosumer, hybrid, or photography camera, whereas the FX30 looks like a professional cinema camera. It lines up perfectly with the FX3 and in the same style as the FX6 and the FX9. But besides that, and the build quality, I have no complaints about either of these two. They both have very deep grips. They're very easy to use. There's a lot of buttons and dials, but there are also some differences. So let's talk about those. So one thing, first of all, is going to be the ports. And the biggest difference to me is the fact that the FX30 has a full-size HDMI and the R7 has a micro HDMI. And you guys probably know how much that bothers me, but it's true. If you're talking about shooting video, you definitely want to have a full-size HDMI, but they both have all the normal jacks you'd have on the side of the camera, including, a microphone and a headphone jack. So onto the back, they both have flippy screens, which is great for filming yourself and for content creation stuff. One thing to point out about these two screens, they're the same size. They're both 3 inches. The R7 has a 1.62 million dot screen and the FX30 is a 2.36 million dot screen. So the resolution is a little bit better on the FX30, but in practice, I didn't really see much of a difference looking at the two screens. I wish both of them were bigger, but this is an improvement over the previous screens from Sony, even their higher end model. So I'm glad to see they're putting more resolution in their screens. Otherwise, there are differences, like if you look at the tops of the cameras, the FX30 has that built-in cage design with quarter 20s on it, also has tally lights all over it. Again, really focused on shooting video. In terms of media, there's also a difference here. The FX30 has the dual slot, so you can shoot with CF Express Type A or SD. You need the CF Express A for shooting in the highest 4K 120 modes. But you can also use SD cards in here for most other modes. The R7 has dual SD card slots, so, pretty easy to work with that. In terms of their batteries, they're very similar. They're both the full-size, normal mirrorless batteries for these two cameras. Overall, using these two cameras, they both work great. They're pleasant to use and hold in your hand. But the other thing about the FX30 is the fact that it does have a fan in it. And so when you're talking about overheating, the FX30 will not overheat. I have gotten the R7 to overheat in a forced test where it was outside on a very hot day. But in normal usage, I have not had the R7 overheat. But it is something to be aware of. If you're shooting long form content in hot environments, the FX30 won't overheat because it has active cooling. Let's talk about lenses. It's always important to talk about lenses when you're trying to decide between two cameras, because when you buy a camera, you're buying into that whole system and all the lenses that are available for it. So you have to figure out what you need. This is where the FX30 has a huge advantage over the R7, but I did make a dedicated video with lens recommendations for the R7, so I'll leave that link down below. The Sony system in general has so many more lens options, not just from Sony, but also third-party options. The R7, at the time of recording this, there are only 2 RFS, which are the crop sensor RF lenses for this camera. Of course, you can use full-frame lenses on a crop sensor camera, so you do have all the full-size RF lenses. You can use all the EF and EFS lenses with a simple $100 adapter. But I would definitely give a huge advantage for the FX30 in terms of lenses, especially wide lenses. If you're using this for vlogging or content creation or real estate or stuff like that, you're gonna have a lot more options with the FX30. When you're deciding between two cameras, you're not just trying to pick out lenses, but you're really buying into an ecosystem. And so you wanna also think about the other cameras you own or may own in the future, or other people that you shoot with. Having matching cameras is so helpful. If they're not exactly the same camera, at least the same brand in terms of the image, the colors, but also the fact that you can share lenses. So if you have an A7S III, an FX3, an FX6, the FX30 will fit in really well. If you're shooting on other cameras like the R5, the R3, the R5C, the C70. I've made videos comparing the R7 to all those cameras, so you should definitely go check those out. It is a great B cam. So think about the other cameras that you are looking to use this with, and that will make a big decision. But if you're going for all in on one camera or the other for the first time, really think about the rest of the ecosystem and the lenses. In terms of price, the FX30 is going for $1,800, whereas the R7 is going for $1,500. Now the $300 difference is not that much, but it is money that you could be putting towards a better lens, microphone, lighting, those sorts of things. Lastly, let's talk about who these two cameras are for. If you do photography in any way, shape, or form, get the R7. It is a way better hybrid camera for doing both photography and videography. Not just for the fact that it has an electronic viewfinder, but the fact that the photography capabilities of this camera are far superior to the FX30. Now the FX30 does take photos and it has a 26 megapixel sensor, but it is way more limited. Now this camera really is geared towards shooting video. So if you're a videographer and you don't take photos, get the FX30. The design, the layout, the ergonomics, the fact that it has a fan to allow you to have long run times without worrying about overheating, the fact that it lines up and matches with the other cinema cameras coming out of Sony. Again, if you're doing exclusively video, I'd probably recommend the FX30, and you also get those better, higher frame rate options, in 4K 60 and 4K 120. That being said, I just want to make a point about the FX30 because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this camera. It is an entry-level or budget-friendly cinema camera. This is not going to be, the same as an FX3 or an A7S III or an FX6. So keep that in mind. Keep your expectations realistic about the FX30. It's an $1,800 camera, whereas the FX3 is a $3,900 camera. You get a lot more for that camera. That being said, if you're just getting into videography and you want a dedicated professional video camera, this is definitely a great option. You can't go wrong with these two cameras, and they both create awesome images. I made a whole lot of videos about the R7. If you are curious about how Cine EI works, which is a big feature in the FX30, I made a video, go check that out here. Or if you'd like to see a review of the R7, click down here. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.